It was the last week of May in 1998. One of those late spring afternoons in central Alabama, when the heat had not yet turned brutal, but carried enough weight to make you feel it, settling on your shoulders like a hand. The air smelled of honeysuckle and cut grass, and the sky stretched pale blue above Clanton, a small town in Chilton County where everybody knew everybody, and most folks left their doors unlocked at night. It was the kind of place where children still rode their bikes unsupervised, where a trip down a dirt road to Grandma's house was as routine as brushing your teeth, and where the thought of something terrible happening felt impossibly distant, almost absurd. Marlie Givens was 9 years old that spring, small for her age but sturdy, with dark brown hair that fell just past her shoulders and a gap between her front teeth that showed every time she smiled. Her teachers at Clanton Elementary described her as cheerful, a little shy around adults but fearless with her friends. She loved animals, especially horses, and kept a notebook full of drawings she had made of them, their manes flowing in imaginary wind, their eyes wide and bright. On weekends, she would beg her parents to drive her out to the county fairgrounds just to watch the riders practice. Her mother, Susan Givens, had promised that when Marlie turned 10, they would look into riding lessons. That Saturday, May 23rd, Marlie had spent most of the morning at home helping her father, David, clean out the garage. It was not glamorous work, sorting through boxes of old tools and Christmas decorations. But Marlie did not mind. She liked being near her father, listening to him hum old country songs while he worked. Around lunchtime, Susan called them in for sandwiches. They ate on the back porch, swatting at flies and talking about nothing in particular. Marlie mentioned that she wanted to visit her grandmother, David's mother, who lived less than a mile away on the other side of town. It was a trip Marlie had made dozens of times, always on her bicycle, a hand-me-down 10-speed with chipped blue paint and a basket on the front that she used to carry books or snacks. The route was simple. Down their driveway, left onto County Road 47, then a half-mile stretch of dirt road that cut through a patch of pine trees before opening up near her grandmother's small white house. Susan hesitated, not because the trip was dangerous, but because she always hesitated. It was a mother's instinct, that quiet voice that whispered, "Be careful," even when there was no reason to worry. But David waved her off. "She'll be fine," he said. "It's broad daylight, and Mama's expecting her." Marlie's grandmother, Ruth Givens, had called earlier that morning to ask if Marlie wanted to come over and help her bake cookies. Ruth was 72, a widow who lived alone and cherished the time she spent with her only grandchild. The plan was for Marlie to stay through the afternoon, and David would pick her up before dinner. At 3:45 p.m., Marlie climbed onto her bike. She wore denim shorts, a faded yellow t-shirt with a cartoon horse on the front, and white sneakers that were starting to come untied. Her backpack, a small navy blue one with fraying straps, was slung over one shoulder. Inside it was a juice box, a pack of fruit snacks, and a dog-eared paperback she had been reading. Susan stood on the porch and watched her daughter pedal down the driveway, her legs pumping steadily, her hair lifting slightly in the breeze. Marlie turned back once and waved, her face lit with that gap-toothed smile. Susan waved back, and then Marlie disappeared around the bend, the sound of her tires crunching on gravel fading into the afternoon quiet. It was a route Marlie could have ridden with her eyes closed, but she would never make it to the other end. By 4:30 p.m., Ruth Givens was starting to worry. She stood at her kitchen window, looking out at the dirt road that curved toward her house, expecting to see Marlie's bike appear at any moment. Ruth had set out the ingredients for cookies, flour and sugar, and chocolate chips lined up neatly on the counter. The oven was preheating. She glanced at the clock again. Marlie should have been there by now. It was only a 10-minute ride, 15 at most if she stopped to pick wildflowers, which she sometimes did. Ruth picked up the phone and dialed Susan's number. "Is Marlie still there?" Ruth asked when Susan answered. "No, Mama Ruth. She left almost an hour ago," Susan said, her voice already tightening with the first thread of concern. "She should have been there by now." Ruth's stomach dropped. "She's not here." There was a pause, the kind that stretches too long, the kind where you can hear fear beginning to take shape. "I'll call David," Susan said. "We'll drive the route. Maybe she stopped somewhere." Susan hung up and shouted for David, who was in the backyard washing the car. When she told him, his first reaction was annoyance. Marlie had probably stopped to talk to a neighbor, or maybe she had a flat tire and was walking the bike home. But Susan's face made him stop. "Get in the truck," he said. They drove slowly down County Road 47, scanning both sides of the road. The pavement gave way to dirt after the first quarter mile, and the trees closed in on either side, tall pines that cast long shadows across the path. David leaned forward over the steering wheel, his eyes moving left and right. Susan sat rigid in the passenger seat, her hands clenched in her lap. They did not speak. The only sound was the crunch of tires on dirt and the faint hum of the engine. It was David who saw it first. About halfway between their house and Ruth's, just where the road curved slightly to the left, something blue caught his eye in the ditch on the right side. He slowed the truck and pulled over. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then David opened the door and stepped out. Susan followed. The bike was lying on its side, in the shallow ditch, the front wheel twisted at an odd angle, the handlebars half buried in leaves and dirt. The basket was still attached, and inside it, Marlie's juice box sat unopened. Her backpack was still strapped to the rear rack, the zipper partly open, the corner of her paperback visible inside. But there were no skid marks on the road, no torn fabric, no blood, no footprints in the dirt leading away. It was as if the bike had been placed there deliberately, carefully, like a stage prop in a play. Susan made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob. David knelt beside the bike and touched the handlebar, as if the metal might tell him something. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Marlie would not have just abandoned her bike. She loved that bike. And even if she had fallen, even if she had gotten hurt, there would be signs. Torn grass, drag marks, something. David stood and turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, the road, the ditch. "Marlie," he shouted. His voice echoed off the pines and disappeared into the stillness. Susan joined him, calling their daughter's name over and over until her voice cracked. But there was no answer, just the wind moving through the trees and the distant caw of a crow. David pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed 911. His hands were shaking so hard he almost dropped it. When the dispatcher answered, he tried to keep his voice steady, but it came out rough and panicked. "My daughter's bike is in a ditch off County Road 47, but she's not here. She's 9 years old. She was riding to her grandmother's house and she never made it. Something's wrong. Something's very wrong." The dispatcher asked him to stay on the line and give his exact location. Within minutes, the sound of sirens cut through the afternoon, quiet growing louder as 2 patrol cars from the Clanton Police Department raced down the dirt road, their lights flashing red and blue against the trees. Officer Randy Colton was the first to arrive. He was a veteran of the Clanton PD, a man in his mid-40s who had grown up in Chilton County and knew most of its residents by name. When he stepped out of his cruiser and saw David and Susan standing beside the bike, their faces pale and stricken. He felt his stomach tighten. He had children of his own. He knew what this looked like. Colton approached the bike slowly, careful not to disturb anything. He took photographs with a disposable camera he kept in his trunk, documenting the position of the bike, the contents of the basket, the backpack. He noted the lack of tire tracks, the absence of footprints, the eerie stillness of the scene. Another officer, younger and less experienced, arrived and began cordoning off the area with yellow tape, stretching it between trees to mark the perimeter. "Did anyone else come down this road today?" Colton asked David. "I don't know," David said. His voice was hollow. "We don't get much traffic out here. It's mostly just locals." Colton radioed for backup and requested a K9 unit. Within 30 minutes, the dirt road was swarming with activity. More patrol cars arrived, a fire truck, an ambulance on standby. Volunteers from the community began showing up, word spreading fast the way it does in small towns. By 5:30 p.m., more than 20 people were combing the woods on either side of the road, calling Marlie's name, pushing through undergrowth, checking behind trees and inside abandoned sheds. The search dogs arrived just before dusk. 2 German shepherds, trained in tracking, were given Marlie's scent from a shirt Susan had brought from home. The dogs circled the bike, sniffing the ground, and then moved toward the tree line. But after only 50 yards, they stopped. Both dogs sat down simultaneously, their handlers exchanging confused glances. The scent had vanished. It was as if Marlie had simply ceased to exist at that spot. One of the handlers, a woman named Teresa Hollis, frowned and tried again. She walked the dogs back to the bike and started over. The same thing happened. The dogs followed a faint trail toward the trees, then stopped abruptly. Hollis had been doing this work for 15 years, and she had never seen anything like it. Scent does not just disappear, not unless the person was carried away or placed in a vehicle. As the sun set and the woods filled with shadows, floodlights were set up along the road. Volunteers continued searching, their flashlights bobbing through the darkness like fireflies. Ruth Givens arrived, her face drawn and pale, and stood beside Susan, holding her daughter-in-law's hand. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. By midnight, the search had expanded to a 2-mile radius. Dive teams were called in to check the nearby creek, though it was shallow and sluggish this time of year. Helicopters from the county sheriff's office circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping across the tree canopy. Every house within 5 miles was visited. Every resident questioned. Had they seen anything? Heard anything? A car? A truck? A child crying? One neighbor, an elderly man named Harold Pritchard, who lived a quarter-mile down the road, mentioned something that made the investigators pause. Around 4 p.m., he had been sitting on his front porch when he heard a sound. A truck door slamming. It was sharp and distinct, the kind of sound that cuts through the afternoon quiet and makes you look up. But Pritchard had not thought much of it. He assumed it was someone turning around or stopping to check a map. He had not seen the vehicle, only heard the sound. "What kind of truck?" Colton asked. Pritchard shrugged. "Couldn't tell you. Didn't see it. Just heard the door slam. Heavy sound, like a work truck maybe." It was not much, but it was something. Colton logged the statement and made a note to follow up. The problem was, there were plenty of work trucks in Chilton County. Farmers, contractors, utility workers. Without a description, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. By dawn on Sunday, exhaustion had set in. Volunteers rotated in shifts, some heading home to rest, while others arrived to take their place. The Clanton Police Department set up a command post at the trailhead near the Givens house, a folding table with maps spread across it, and a whiteboard listing tasks and assignments. Chief of Police Martin Hale stood before a group of deputies and volunteers, his voice hoarse from shouting instructions all night. "We keep searching," he said. "Every inch of these woods, every ditch, every culvert. This little girl is out there, and we are going to find her." But as the hours passed, the hope that Marlie was simply lost or injured began to fade. The dogs had found no trail. The helicopters had spotted nothing. The dive teams had come up empty. And the bike, still sitting in that ditch, seemed to mock them with its silence, offering no answers, only questions. By Sunday evening, the media had arrived. News vans from Birmingham and Montgomery parked along the road, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky. Reporters interviewed David and Susan, who stood before the cameras with red-rimmed eyes and trembling voices, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Susan clutched a photograph of Marlie, the one from her school picture that year, where she was smiling with that gap-toothed grin. "Please," Susan said, her voice breaking. "If you know anything at all, please call the police. We just want our baby home." The story aired on the evening news across Alabama, and by Monday morning, tips were pouring in. The police set up a dedicated hotline, and volunteers manned the phones around the clock. Most of the calls were well-meaning but useless. Someone thought they saw a little girl at a gas station 2 counties over, but it turned out to be a different child. Another caller reported a suspicious van, but it belonged to a florist making deliveries. The leads went nowhere. As the search entered its 3rd day, the mood shifted. What had started as a rescue operation was beginning to feel like a recovery. No one said it out loud, but the thought hung in the air like smoke. If Marlie was out there, if she had simply wandered off, they would have found her by now. The terrain was not that difficult. The weather had been mild. She would have heard them calling. She would have come out, unless she could not. By the end of the first week, the official search was scaled back. The volunteers had covered more than 20 square miles, checking every barn, every shed, every abandoned structure. They had searched fields and forests, creeks and drainage ditches. Bloodhounds, helicopters, and ground-penetrating radar had all been deployed. And they had found nothing. Not a shoe, not a piece of torn clothing, not a single trace of Marlie Givens beyond that abandoned bike in the ditch. The investigation shifted from search and rescue to criminal investigation. Detectives from the Chilton County Sheriff's Office took over, and the Clanton Police Department worked in coordination. Every registered sex offender within a 50-mile radius was interviewed and alibi checked. None of them panned out. Marlie's family was scrutinized, as is standard in cases like this. But David and Susan were quickly cleared. Their grief was too raw, too real. And besides, they had been together all afternoon, accounted for, with no gaps in their timeline. The bike was taken to the state forensics lab in Montgomery. Technicians dusted it for fingerprints and found only Marlie's. Faint smudges on the handlebars and the brake levers. The backpack was examined inch by inch. Inside, they found the juice box, the fruit snacks, the paper bag. Nothing unusual. No signs of tampering. The straps showed normal wear, and the zipper had been left partly open, as if Marlie had reached in to grab something while riding. But it was the placement of the bike that continued to nag at investigators. It had not crashed. It had not been thrown. It had been placed in that ditch, carefully, almost deliberately. The front wheel was turned at an unnatural angle, as if someone had picked up the bike and set it down without thinking about how it should look. And there were no skid marks on the road, no signs that Marlie had tried to stop or swerve. It was as if she had simply vanished mid-ride, and someone had disposed of the bike afterward. Detective William Ashford, the lead investigator, spent hours walking that stretch of road, trying to piece together what had happened. He was a methodical man, deliberate in his thinking, and he did not like the way this case felt. It was too clean, too empty. Abductions, especially of children, usually left evidence. A scuff mark, a dropped item, a witness who saw something, even if they did not realize it at the time. But here, there was nothing. Just that single sound, the truck door slamming, reported by Harold Pritchard. Ashford re-interviewed Pritchard multiple times, hoping the old man might remember more details. What time exactly did he hear the sound? Where was he standing? What else was happening at that moment? But Pritchard could only repeat what he had said before. Around 4 RPM, a truck door. Heavy sound, that was it. Ashford also canvassed the area, knocking on doors, asking residents if they remembered seeing any unfamiliar vehicles that day. A few people mentioned seeing a white pickup truck, but no one could remember a license plate or even a make and model. Someone else thought they saw a dark-colored sedan, but they were not sure of the time. The more Ashford dug, the murkier it became. Rural roads saw all kinds of traffic, especially on weekends. Hunters, fishermen, people visiting family. Trying to isolate one specific vehicle from that Saturday felt impossible. As May turned into June, the case began to slip from the headlines. The news vans left. The volunteers stopped showing up. Life in Clanton returned to a cautious normalcy, though the town would never feel quite the same. Parents kept their children closer. Bikes sat unused in garages. The dirt road where Marlie's bike had been found became a place people avoided, as if the ground itself carried bad luck. David and Susan Givens did not return to normal. They could not. Every day felt like a battle just to breathe. They kept Marlie's room exactly as she had left it, her bed made, her stuffed animals arranged on the shelf, her drawings of horses taped to the wall. Susan would sit in there for hours, holding Marlie's favorite blanket, waiting for a phone call that never came. The police assured them the investigation was still active, that they were following every lead. But as the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years, the promises began to ring hollow. Marlie's case file grew thicker, filled with witness statements and forensic reports and dead-end leads, but it brought them no closer to answers. By the end of 1998, the case was officially classified as cold, and Marlie Givens became a ghost, a name whispered in quiet conversations, a cautionary tale told to children, a little girl who rode her bike down a dirt road one Saturday afternoon and vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a blue bicycle, a juice box, and a family shattered beyond repair. By the time the calendar turned to 2000, Marlie Givens' disappearance had become part of Clanton's local folklore. The kind of story that lingered in the collective memory, but was spoken about less and less as time passed. The dirt road where her bike had been found was still there, rutted and overgrown now. And though some residents still used it as a shortcut, most avoided it. Parents told their children not to ride their bikes alone, and the story of the little girl who vanished was repeated like a campfire ghost story, a warning wrapped in tragedy. David and Susan Givens aged in ways that had nothing to do with years. Susan's hair, once dark and vibrant, turned gray by her early 40s. David developed a permanent stoop, as if the weight of not knowing had bent him physically. They stayed in Clanton, unable to leave, tethered to the place where their daughter had last been seen. Every year on Marlie's birthday, May 12th, they held a vigil at the spot where the bike had been found. They would bring flowers, light candles, and stand in silence, hoping that this year, maybe this year, someone would come forward with information. Ruth Givens, Marlie's grandmother, passed away in 2004. She had never stopped blaming herself, convinced that if she had driven to pick up Marlie that day, if she had not asked her to ride her bike, things would have been different. She died without answers, and David buried her beside his father in the Clanton Cemetery, a small plot shaded by an oak tree. At the funeral, Susan whispered to David, "At least she's with Marlie now." David did not respond. He did not believe in that kind of comfort. The original investigators retired one by one. Detective William Ashford, who had spent countless sleepless nights working Marlie's case, left the sheriff's office in 2003 and moved to Florida. Before he left, he handed the case file to his replacement, a younger detective named Mark Holloway, and told him, "This one will haunt you." It haunted me. Holloway nodded, but he did not fully understand what Ashford meant until he opened the file and saw the photograph of Marlie's bike lying in that ditch, the handlebars twisted, the basket still holding a juice box. That image stayed with him. Over the years, the case was revisited sporadically. In 2005, a task force reviewing unsolved child abductions across Alabama re-examined Marlie's disappearance. But they came to the same conclusions the original investigators had. No physical evidence, no witnesses, no leads. The case was returned to the cold case files, where it sat alongside dozens of other unsolved disappearances, each one a small tragedy, each one someone's worst nightmare. Clanton itself changed slowly. New businesses opened, old ones closed. The town's population grew slightly, fueled by retirees moving south for the warmer weather. But the memory of Marlie Givens persisted. In 2010, a local journalist wrote a retrospective piece for the Clanton Advertiser, marking the 12th anniversary of her disappearance. The article included interviews with David and Susan, who had aged into a kind of quiet resignation. "We will never stop hoping," Susan said. "But we have accepted that we may never know." The article generated some renewed interest, a few calls to the tip line, but nothing substantive. By 2015, David Givens's health began to fail. Years of stress and grief had taken their toll, and he suffered a heart attack in the fall of that year. He survived, but he was never the same. He became withdrawn, spending most of his days sitting on the porch, staring at the dirt road that led toward Ruth's old house, which had been sold years earlier. On a cold January morning in 2016, David had a second heart attack. This time, it was fatal. Susan found him slumped in his chair, his face peaceful as if he had finally let go of the weight he had carried for so long. At David's funeral, Susan stood beside the casket and thought about how much death had surrounded their family since that day in 1998. Marlie, Ruth, now David. She felt like she was the last one standing, the only witness to a tragedy that had consumed 3 generations. She told a friend later that she sometimes wished she could just let go. Stop waiting, stop hoping. But she could not. Something inside her refused to give up. A stubborn ember of belief that one day, somehow, the truth would come out. That belief was vindicated in the most unexpected way. In early 2020, the Alabama Attorney General's office announced the creation of a new cold case unit, a specialized division tasked with re-examining unsolved homicides and disappearances using modern forensic technology. The unit was small, just 5 investigators and 2 forensic analysts. but they were dedicated and well-funded. Their mandate was simple: take cases that had gone cold decades ago and apply new techniques, advanced DNA analysis, digital forensics, genealogical databases, to see if fresh leads could be generated. Detective Laura Hensley was one of the first investigators assigned to the unit. She was 34 years old, a native of Birmingham who had joined the Alabama Bureau of Investigation in 2012. She had always been drawn to cold cases, fascinated by the idea that time, rather than erasing evidence, sometimes preserved it in unexpected ways. When she joined the cold case unit, she requested a list of unsolved child abductions from the 1990s. Marlie Givens' name was near the top. Hensley had heard of the case before, though only in passing. She had been a teenager in 1998, living 2 hours north of Clanton, but she remembered seeing Marlie's face on the news. Now, as she sat in her office in Montgomery and opened the thick case file, she felt a familiar pull, the sense that this was a case that deserved another look. The file was a mess, as old case files often are. Witness statements were mixed in with forensic reports. Photographs were scattered and unlabeled. Some documents were faded and barely legible. Hensley spent 2 weeks organizing everything, creating a digital timeline, scanning documents, and inputting data into a database. She reread every witness statement, every investigator's note, every forensic report. She studied the photographs of the bike, the road, the woods. She listened to the 911 call David Givens had made, his voice shaking with panic. One detail stood out to her: the backpack. According to the original forensic report, the backpack had been examined for fingerprints and trace evidence, but the technology in 1998 was limited. Hensley wondered if there might be something they had missed. She requested that the backpack, which had been stored in an evidence locker at the Chilton County Sheriff's Office, be sent to the State Forensics Lab for re-examination. The backpack arrived in Montgomery in late June 2020. It was sealed in a clear plastic evidence bag, the fabric faded and stiff with age. The lab technician, a woman named Dr. Angela Martinez, opened the bag carefully and laid the backpack out on a sterile examination table. She photographed it from every angle, then began a painstaking inspection using a high-powered microscope. It took her 3 days to find it. Embedded in the fabric seams near the zipper, so small they were almost invisible to the naked eye, were several fibers. They were synthetic, not cotton or wool, and they did not match the material of the backpack itself. Dr. Martinez carefully extracted the fibers using tweezers and placed them in a sealed container. Under the microscope, she could see that the fibers were a tan or beige color, with faint red threading woven through them. The texture was consistent with automotive upholstery, the kind used in commercial vehicles. Dr. Martinez ran the fibers through a spectral analysis to determine their chemical composition. The results indicated that the fibers were made from a polyester nylon blend, commonly used in the interiors of trucks and vans manufactured in the mid to late 1990s. She sent the fibers to the FBI's fiber database, a massive collection of textile samples from vehicles, clothing, and household fabrics. 3 weeks later, the FBI sent back a report. The fibers were consistent with the interior upholstery of a 1995 to 1999 Ford F-350, specifically the commercial cab package used in tow trucks and utility vehicles. When Detective Hensley received the report, she felt her pulse quicken. It was the first real lead in 22 years. Hensley immediately contacted the Chilton County Sheriff's Office and requested copies of all vehicle registration records from 1998, focusing specifically on commercial trucks. She wanted to know who in Clanton had owned a Ford F-350 tow truck during the time of Marlie's disappearance. The records were old, some of them still stored on paper, and it took several weeks to compile the information. But eventually, a list emerged. 3 individuals or businesses in the Clanton area had owned Ford F-350 tow trucks in 1998. The first was a large towing company that operated out of a garage on Highway 31. The second was a farmer who used a tow truck to haul equipment. The third was a man named Thomas Earl Briggs, who ran a small, independent towing operation out of his home. Hensley began with the towing company. The owner, now retired, was cooperative and provided maintenance records showing that their trucks had been repainted and reupholstered multiple times over the years. None of the current vehicles matched the fiber profile. The farmer's truck had been sold in 2001 and eventually scrapped. That left Thomas Earl Briggs. Hensley pulled up Briggs's records. He was 67 years old now, living in Prescott, Arizona. In 1998, he'd been 43, married, and operating a small towing business called Briggs Roadside Assistance. The business had been registered to his home address on the outskirts of Clanton. According to county records, Briggs had owned a 1997 Ford F-350 tow truck, tan in color, with a red stripe along the side. The vehicle registration had been active until September 1998, when Briggs had moved out of state. After that, there was no record of the truck. It had never been re-registered, never been sold through official channels. It had simply disappeared. Hensley felt a chill. Marlie had vanished in late May 1998. Briggs had left Alabama in September of that same year. That was only 4 months later. It could have been a coincidence, but Hensley did not believe in coincidences. She dug deeper. Thomas Briggs had no criminal record, not even a speeding ticket. He had been married to a woman named Linda, and they had no children. In 1998, Briggs had worked irregular hours, responding to calls for roadside assistance, towing broken-down vehicles, helping stranded motorists. It was the kind of work that put him on dirt roads and back highways, exactly the kind of places where a predator could operate unnoticed. Hensley contacted the Arizona Department of Motor Vehicles and confirmed that Briggs was still living in Prescott. He had remarried in 2005 after divorcing Linda in 2003. He worked as a mechanic at a small auto repair shop. On paper, he looked like an ordinary retiree, someone who had left Alabama for a fresh start. But Hensley could not shake the feeling that there was more to the story. She contacted the Prescott Police Department and requested assistance in conducting a discreet background check on Briggs. She also reached out to Linda Briggs, who was still living in Alabama, remarried and going by a different name. Linda agreed to meet with Hensley in person. They met at a coffee shop in Birmingham. Linda was in her early 60s now, a small, quiet woman with graying hair and tired eyes. She told Hensley that her marriage to Thomas had been difficult. He was controlling, paranoid, secretive. He did not like her asking questions about his work. He would disappear for hours at a time, claiming he was on a call, but he never kept records, never logged his jobs properly. When Linda had finally worked up the courage to file for divorce in 2002, Thomas had not fought it. He had simply left, moved to Arizona, and never looked back. "Did he ever mention Marlie Givens?" Hensley asked. Linda hesitated. Everyone in Clanton knew about Marlie. It was all anyone talked about that summer. Thomas never said much about it, but I remember thinking it was strange. He seemed nervous, like he did not want to be around when people were talking about it. Did he ever explain why he left Alabama? He said there was no work, that the towing business was not making enough money. But we were not struggling. We had enough. I think he just wanted to leave. Hensley made notes and thanked Linda for her time. As she drove back to Montgomery, she kept replaying Linda's words in her head. He seemed nervous. He wanted to leave. It was not proof, but it was suggestive. Back at her office, Hensley drafted an affidavit requesting a search warrant for Thomas Briggs's property in Arizona. She outlined the fiber evidence, the timing of his departure from Alabama, and the statements from Linda. A judge reviewed the affidavit and signed the warrant. Within a week, arrangements were made for Arizona law enforcement to execute the search. On a clear morning in late September 2021, Detective Hensley boarded a flight to Phoenix. She was accompanied by 2 other investigators from the cold case unit, and they were met at the airport by detectives from the Prescott Police Department. The plan was to execute the search warrant early the next morning before Briggs left for work. Thomas Briggs lived in a modest, single-story house on the edge of Prescott, surrounded by desert scrub and low hills. The property was neat, the lawn well-maintained, the driveway empty except for a silver sedan. Hensley and the team arrived just after dawn, the sky streaked with orange and pink. They knocked on the door, and after a moment, a man answered. He was tall, thin, with graying hair and a lined face. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, and he looked at the assembled officers with a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Thomas Briggs?" Hensley said. "Yes?" "I'm Detective Laura Hensley with the Alabama Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant to search your property." Briggs blinked, his face going pale. "What? Why?" "It's related to an ongoing investigation. Please step outside, sir." Briggs's wife appeared behind him, a younger woman with wide, frightened eyes. "What's going on?" she asked. "Ma'am, please step outside with your husband," one of the Prescott officers said. The search took most of the day. Officers went through every room, every closet, every drawer. They photographed everything, bagged items of interest, and cataloged them meticulously. In the garage, they found tools, old car parts, and boxes of papers. One box contained documents from Briggs's time in Alabama, including old business receipts and vehicle maintenance records. Among those papers, Hensley found something that made her pause. A work logbook from 1998, handwritten, with dates and brief notes about service calls. She flipped through the pages carefully. Most entries were mundane. Flat tire on Highway 31. Jump start on County Road 12. But one entry, dated May 23, 1998, caught her eye. It read, "Dirt road service call. No customer name. No location. No payment recorded." Hensley felt her heart skip. May 23rd was the day Marlie had vanished. She showed the entry to the other investigators. "Why would he log a service call with no details?" she asked. "No name, no payment?" One of the detectives shrugged. "Maybe he forgot to fill it in. Or maybe there was no service call," Hensley said. "Maybe this was something else." They continued searching and found another item of interest. A key to a storage unit, tucked inside an old toolbox. The key had a tag with an address in Prescott. Hensley requested a second warrant for the storage unit, and by late afternoon, it was approved. The storage unit was located on the outskirts of town, part of a large facility with rows of identical metal units. The manager provided access, and Hensley and the team opened the door. Inside, they found boxes, old furniture, and tools. But in the back corner, covered with a tarp, they found something that made everyone stop. An old work jacket, faded and stained, with Briggs Roadside Assistance embroidered on the back. Hensley pulled the jacket out carefully. It smelled of dust and old oil. She turned it over and checked the pockets. Empty. But when she examined the fabric under a flashlight, she saw something that made her breath catch. Along the sleeve, near the cuff, were faint stains. They looked like dirt, or maybe something else. She bagged the jacket as evidence. By the time they finished, the sun was setting. Thomas Briggs was taken to the Prescott Police Department for questioning. Hensley sat across from him in a small, windowless interview room. Briggs had a lawyer present, a public defender who looked young and nervous. "Mr. Briggs," Hensley began, "we found evidence linking you to the disappearance of Marlie Givens in 1998. Briggs stared at her, his face expressionless. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Fibers from your truck were found on Marlie's backpack. Can you explain that?" "I ran a towing business. Lots of people were in and out of my truck. Could have been anyone." "Why did you leave Alabama in September 1998, just a few months after Marlie disappeared?" "I told my wife. There was no work." "That's not what she said." Briggs did not respond. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something in his ear. Briggs shook his head. "Mr. Briggs," Hensley continued, "we found a logbook with an entry from May 23, 1998. A dirt road service call with no details. Can you explain that?" "I don't remember. That was a long time ago." "Where is your tow truck from 1998? "I sold it." "To who?" "I don't remember. There's no record of a sale." Briggs' jaw tightened. "Maybe I scrapped it." "Where?" "I don't remember." The interview continued for hours, but Briggs gave nothing. He denied everything, his answers short and evasive. His lawyer eventually ended the session, and Briggs was released pending further investigation. But Hensley was not discouraged. She had what she needed: the fibers, the logbook, the jacket. It was enough to build a case. Thomas Earl Briggs was formally arrested 3 months later, in December 2021. By then, forensic analysis of the work jacket from the storage unit had revealed something critical: traces of blood on the sleeve. DNA testing confirmed that the blood belonged to Marlie Givens, a match to samples taken from her toothbrush and hairbrush, which Susan Givens had kept all these years. The arrest made national headlines. 23-year-old cold case cracked. Alabama man charged in 1998, disappearance of 9-year-old girl. News outlets from across the country descended on Clanton, and the story dominated the local news cycle for weeks. Susan Givens, now 68 years old, appeared at a press conference alongside Detective Hensley and the Chilton County District Attorney. Her face was drawn, her eyes red from crying, but her voice was steady. "I have waited 23 years for this moment," Susan said. "I never gave up hope that we would find out what happened to my daughter. I want to thank Detective Hensley and everyone who worked so hard to bring my baby home." Marlie's body had never been found, but under Alabama law, a person could be charged with murder without a body if there was sufficient evidence. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Tillman, built their case around the fiber evidence, the blood on the jacket, the suspicious timing of Briggs's departure from Alabama, and the entry in his logbook. They also presented testimony from Linda Briggs, who described her ex-husband's strange behavior in the months following Marlie's disappearance. Briggs pleaded not guilty. His defense attorney, a seasoned lawyer named Michael Grayson, argued that the evidence was circumstantial. The fibers could have transferred innocently. The blood could have come from a cut Marlie suffered while riding her bike, and Briggs could have helped her without realizing who she was. The logbook entry proved nothing. Grayson also pointed out that without a body, there was no way to determine the exact cause of death or even confirm that Marlie was dead. The trial began in June 2022, held in the Chilton County Courthouse in Clanton. The courtroom was packed every day, with spectators lining up hours before the doors opened. Susan Givens sat in the front row, flanked by family members and friends. Across the aisle, Thomas Briggs sat beside his lawyer, his face impassive, his hands folded on the table. The prosecution presented their case over the course of 2 weeks. Dr. Angela Martinez, the forensic analyst who had discovered the fibers, testified about the rarity of the match and the likelihood that Marlie's backpack had been in direct contact with the interior of Briggs's truck. A fiber expert from the FBI corroborated her findings, stating that the probability of the fibers coming from a different source was less than 1 in 10 million. Detective Hensley took the stand and walked the jury through the investigation, explaining how the case had been reopened, how the fibers had been discovered, and how the evidence had led them to Briggs. She presented the logbook entry, the jacket, and the timeline showing that Briggs had left Alabama just 4 months after Marlie's disappearance. Linda Briggs testified as well, describing her marriage to Thomas and his secretive behavior. "He never wanted me asking questions," she said. "He would get angry if I tried to look at his records or ask where he had been. After Marlie disappeared, he became even more withdrawn. I remember thinking something was wrong, but I did not know what." The defense called their own experts, including a forensic consultant who argued that fiber transfer could occur in a variety of ways and did not prove direct contact. Grayson also presented character witnesses who described Briggs as a quiet, hard-working man who had never been in trouble with the law. But the most damaging testimony came from a surprise witness, a man named Gerald Hooper, who had worked as a mechanic in Clanton in the late 1990s. Hooper testified that in the fall of 1998, Thomas Briggs had brought his tow truck to Hooper's garage and asked him to clean the interior thoroughly. "He wanted it stripped down and scrubbed," Hooper said. "I thought it was strange because the truck looked clean to me. But he insisted. He said he was selling it and wanted it to look good. I did what he asked, then I never saw the truck again." The prosecution seized on this testimony, arguing that Briggs had been trying to destroy evidence. "Why would a man clean a truck so thoroughly if he had nothing to hide?" Tillman asked the jury in his closing argument. "Why would he leave Alabama just months after a little girl vanished from a dirt road he admitted to driving regularly? Why would he keep a jacket with her blood on it for 23 years? The answer is simple. Because he is guilty. Because he took Marlie Givens, and he has been running ever since." Grayson countered by emphasizing the lack of a body, the absence of eyewitnesses, and the circumstantial nature of the evidence. "The prosecution wants you to believe that a few fibers and an old logbook entry are enough to convict a man of murder," he said. "But without a body, without proof of how Marlie died, without anyone who saw what happened, you cannot be certain. And if you are not certain, you must acquit." The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts, including felony murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. Thomas Briggs showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but Susan Givens collapsed into the arms of the woman sitting beside her, sobbing with relief. Briggs was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, addressed him directly before imposing the sentence. "Mr. Briggs, you took a 9-year-old girl from her family, and you have spent 23 years lying about it. You have shown no remorse, no willingness to help this family find peace. I hope you spend the rest of your life reflecting on what you have done." Briggs was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He never looked at Susan. With investigators to search for Marlie's remains. Briggs refused to cooperate, maintaining his innocence and declining to answer any questions. Ground-penetrating radar was used to search properties Briggs had owned or rented in Alabama, but nothing was found. Susan held out hope that one day Marlie's body would be recovered. But as the months passed, she began to accept that it might never happen. "I have some closure now," Susan told a reporter in early 2023. "I know who took my daughter, and I know he is in prison. That is more than I had for 23 years. I just wish I could bring her home." A memorial service was held for Marlie in the spring of 2023, marking the 25th anniversary of her disappearance. The service was held at the Clanton Community Church, and hundreds of people attended. Susan placed a headstone in the Givens family plot, next to David and Ruth. The headstone bore Marlie's name, her birth and disappearance dates, and a simple inscription, "Forever in our hearts." Detective Laura Hensley was honored by the Alabama Attorney General's office for her work on the case. She continued to work in the cold case unit, using the lessons learned from Marlie's case to re-examine other unsolved disappearances. "Marlie's case taught me that no case is ever truly cold," Hensley said in an interview. "As long as there is evidence, as long as there are people who care, there is always hope." The dirt road where Marlie's bike was found was officially renamed Marlie's Mile by the Chilton County Commission. A small memorial marker was placed at the spot where the bike had been discovered, engraved with Marlie's name and the dates of her life. Flowers are left there regularly, placed by people who never knew her but who remember her story. For Susan Givens, life continued in a quiet, subdued way. She remained in Clanton, living in the same house where Marlie had grown up. She kept Marlie's room unchanged, a shrine to a daughter she would never see again. On the anniversary of Marlie's disappearance each year, Susan walked down to Marlie's Mile and stood at the memorial marker, whispering words only she and her daughter could hear. The case of Marlie Givens became a symbol of persistence, a reminder that justice, though delayed, can still be achieved. It was a story of grief and loss, but also of determination and hope. And though Marlie's body was never found, her memory lived on in the people who refused to forget her, in the detective who fought for her, and in the mother who never stopped believing that the truth would come to light. As the sun set over Clanton one evening, casting long shadows across Marlie's Mile, Susan stood at the memorial marker and placed a single white rose at its base. The wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of honeysuckle. And for a moment, Susan could almost hear her daughter's laughter echoing down that dirt road, a sound that would never truly fade. 23 years could not erase her memory. And one fiber, no thicker than a hair, had finally brought her home.